really the idea that there's a given set of invariant aspects that stay invariant, the same, under a given set of transformations. Now that sounds like a very kind of abstract concept. It just means that you basically have transformations which can give a lot of diversity and variety and seeming a kind of myriad kind of pattern, but underlying all that myriad pattern and diversity is something utterly simple and the same, something invariant. I guess with respect to the fractal brain theory and the ideas involved is this idea of recursively nested symmetry. Now, suppose I take a shape and I basically make smaller copies of that shape, place that shape within itself. Then I repeat that and I recursively take smaller copies of that shape within those smaller pieces. Then I basically have a shape that's self-similar, that's recursively self-similar.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. I really hope you're enjoying this third series as much as I am. And if you are, please help me get this in front of like-minded minds like yourselves by sharing it with your friends, by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes or subscribing with the bell if you're on YouTube. It really, really helps me get it out to other like minds. And of course, hit us up on Facebook and Instagram if you want to join the fascinating conversation that we've got going on around these topics with the listeners. Now, today we have the extraordinary fractal brain theory to discuss. Now, after episode 38 about the world as a neural network with Russian physicist and computer scientist Vitaly Vanchurin, I've become more open to a unified theory of universe, particularly if it reconciles quantum mechanics and general relativity, as Vanchurin's equations seem to do. So when I was recommended today's guest's fractal brain theory by one of you wonderful listeners, I was curious, if a little skeptical, given all of the psychedelic hype around fractal geometry. So a symmetrical theory of repeating, self-similar, self-modifying behavior in the universe isn't so far from this vision of a universe as a thriving, adaptable neural network. And according to today's guest, the symmetry directly connects the often divorced worlds of neurons, brains, and intelligence with the world of genes, evolution, and life. So I can't wait. He is, of course, multidisciplinary researcher, computer scientist, musician, and author, Y.H. Tsang. He's a self-taught thinker in the world of neurology, evolutionary biology, consciousness, and philosophy of mind. Tsang is in the unique position of combining those traditions into a single theory of brain that promises to solve even the hard problem of consciousness. Trained in computer science at Imperial College, he wrote the first version of his fractal brain theory in 2016 in his book of that same name. And it was picked up by the quantum consciousness researcher Stuart Hameroff, who invited him to the Science of Consciousness conference, alongside heavyweights in the field like David Chalmers, Roger Penrose, and Donald Hoffman, Sue Blackmore, Dan Dennett, many of whom have been on the show already. And this recognition catapulted his theory into the field. So it's with great pleasure that I include it on the show for us to compare alongside the theories of all those giants. So without further ado, let's go. So Wei Tsang, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you today?
We are great. So we are well caffeinated because this is a morning interview. This is unusual. So we are basically we've got to be careful not to not to talk too fast because we are just had our mocha.
Yes, indeed. Why? So if we start vibrating, listeners, it's not a strange digital effect. It's just the caffeine. Now, Wei, I love to start by asking my guests about their first ever sort of reflective conscious thoughts, philosophical conscious thoughts, usually sometimes sort of, between sort of 6, 8, 10 years old. What questions can you remember from that time, those really important burning philosophical questions, the first ones?
Oh gosh, I think my head was really kind of quite active at that age, and I think I absorbed loads of kind of science fiction, kind of read science fiction comics like 2000 AD back in the 70s, and I explored all these kind of metaphysical, cosmological, even theological questions. And I remember kind of having these discussions with my two older brothers, who introduced me to lots of kind of more mature ideas. I guess I really did consider things like what is the nature of God, even from a very early age, even from age 5, even 4. I used to contemplate time, and where does time come from? The future, is the future already there, or whatever, or the nature of existence? So I think from a very early age, I really was considering things like consciousness and who am I and what is the nature of existence. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Wow,
and that
that's
kind of continued,
really early.
Really, yeah.
That's really early. Like, that's much earlier than anyone else I've spoken to about that time of life. That's really interesting. A lot of people have memories from that time of thoughts, but they don't actually have those really, really important philosophical questions. That's interesting. So, Wei, if you don't mind, let's get straight into your fractal brain theory. And I want to build it up step by step. So take the listeners with us right up to your theory of everything. Now, let's start with this crucial idea of symmetry, both in the universe and in science and the way we think about the universe. And tell us, first of all, in a general sense, what is symmetry, and how, in your theory, symmetry connects life on the one hand and intelligence on the other.
Symmetry is this really fundamental concept. Some scientists, some thinkers, philosophers think that science is possible because of symmetry, and other scientists even go as far as to say, some scientists even go as far as to say that science is symmetry. So in a nutshell, let's explain in layman terms what symmetry is. I mean, it's this idea that of change and immunity to change. Something changes, something stays the same. Let's unpack this. Back in high school, we learned about this idea of symmetry from a Renaissance conception that emerged during Renaissance times. The notion that you have a square, you can rotate it 90 degrees, 180 degrees, etc. You can reflect it along certain axes, and the square appears as the same. And that's how we first learned about symmetry. Now, it's a very general thing. In a kind of one sentence, if you want to capture it in one sentence, it's really the idea that there's a given set of invariant aspects that stay invariant, the same, under a given set of transformations. Now, that sounds like a very kind of abstract concept. It just means that you basically have transformations which can give a lot of diversity and variety and seeming a kind of myriad kind of pattern, but underlying all that myriad pattern and diversity is something utterly simple and the same, something invariant. So the idea in science is basically that we have this kind of like universe of complexity and seeming like different laws and different kind of phenomena all around the universe and around the planet. But this idea that we can unify these separately kind of like happening and also seemingly different kind of phenomena into a unifying concept. Let me explain. The idea of universal theories and unified theories. Okay. The idea of a universal theory is that basically, say, the laws of, say Newton's laws, okay, to illustrate, Newton's laws of motion. So you kind of fire a cannonball on this planet and you trace a parabola, it's a certain shape. Now you do the same thing on another planet, different amount of gravity, air resistance, you get the same basic shape. So basically it's a translation invariant. It's basically, there's a symmetry that's universal across the universe. So universal theories. Now the notion of unified theories, let's say electricity, magnetism, and light appear as very different phenomena. So a magnet, kind of a lightning bolt, lights, and kind of like they seem as different, but we know that there's this thing called electromagnetic spectrumness. Let's call it that. Okay, there's a unified theory, and underlying it is a symmetry. There's an invariant aspect behind it. You can transform light into electricity. You can transform electricity through electric motors and magnets, it's an electric car, into motion. And then you break the electric car, and then the motion becomes electricity again. and then the battery might power the headlights. You transform some invariant aspect into different seeming things, but underlying it is this invariant electromagnetic spectrumness. So that in a nutshell, captures the notion of universal and unified theories in science. And we think that this fundamental concept is necessary to understand the brain and mind. It's such a simple proposition, isn't it? Yeah. You have this fundamental concept in science. How can we apply it to the brain and the mind? And we think, and even functional genomics. And this is essentially what the fractal brain theory is about.
And it's combining two fields that we don't necessarily associate. On the one hand, genes and life and evolution, and on the other, neurons and brains and intelligence and creativity and learning. Tell us how Symmetry does that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the kind of outrageous claims that the fractal brain theory has made, for which I've received a lot of flack over the years, but which recent empirical evidence, literally, has come out in the past couple of years, has totally kind of vindicated this idea. This crazy idea is that the genome in each cell works like a tiny fractal brain. Okay, so this sounds completely wild, and again, it's for this notion of symmetry. We have to obviously abstract away certain details. A genome within each cell looks nothing like a brain. Okay, and a gene looks nothing like a neuron. By abstracting away into the pure kind of mathematical essence, we can show that what a genome and gene regulatory mechanisms is doing, what a neuron is doing, is essentially identical. And from that, we can construct the idea of, neurons making up neural assemblies, making up a brain, to genes and gene regulatory mechanisms, making gene regulatory networks to the genome. And then what does a gene compute? What does the genome compute? Ontogenesis, a body. And what do thoughts compute? What does the brain compute? Thoughts. And we can also show a symmetry, basically an invariant aspect, something that's essentially the same, a kind of mathematical formalism, a language that can capture ontogenesis and thought and behavior in the same symmetrical invariant description. And onto, a more kind of like a generally accepted idea, the idea that evolution and learning, and somehow evolution has happened in the brain, that's kind of quite mainstream, neural Darwinism, MEMS, that's quite accepted. We put it on more firm foundations. We think there's a fundamental symmetry between life and intelligence. And this is what I call the fractal brain theory in the past 10 years became something far deeper. What I kind of had an intuition that a gene would work like a neuron, and also that a genome is like a tiny brain. It became a more fully fledged idea that life, on all the aspects of life and all the aspects of intelligence, there's a perfect symmetry between the two. I need to quickly explain, because this is really essential, because the recent findings to do with genes and neurons, which literally have appeared in the past 5-10 years, really clear up two fallacies to do with neurons and brains. Okay, I'll explain what they are. And once you see what they are, you can see how genes and neurons converge. They are the notion of, in genomics, the notion of junk DNA. That somehow there are these coding regions that encode proteins and metabolic enzymes, etc. And there are these kind of junk regions. Now, the fallacy to do with neurons is to do with this kind of idea of neurons, which is found in every single book on theoretical neuroscience, every single book on neural networks and artificial intelligence. Okay. It is this idea that you have the neuron as this kind of cell body, and this inputs to the neurons are like spokes of a wheel going into the cell body. And basically, it's like linear algebra. You have the vector of inputs and the vector representing the weights of the neuron. And then, you multiply two vectors together and you get a summation. And then you have an activation function, a kind of probabilistic kind of activation, a summing of the inputs. Now, that is universally almost kind of like taught. And it's completely wrong. It's completely mistaken. The new understanding of neurons and new understanding of what was called junk DNA shows that basically what is going on is that basically this junk DNA is regulating the firing of the activation of the gene in a way that is akin to Boolean algebra, combinatorial logic. Okay, so there's even papers talking about genes and gene regulatory mechanisms doing what's called disjunctive normal form logic. It means, in a nutshell, basically, that each you have a gene, and basically you have what's called a loopome. You have these loops looping around a gene from three loops up to 15. with each loop as a cis-regulatory module, and the cis-regulatory modules have transcription factor binding sites. Okay, now cut long story short, it means that basically if this transcription factor and this one all bind onto this cis-regulatory module, the gene will fire. And that this cis-regulatory module, this loop, or that one, this kind of disjunction of conjunctions, all these separate OR cases will make the neuron fire, or sorry, make the gene activate, the gene fire. Now, the latest findings of neurons show exactly the same thing. We have this notion of dendritic processing, where each of the main branches into a cell body, each of those branches, each of them can make the entire neuron fire. So it's that branch, or that branch, or that one can make the entire neuron fire. Now, this new findings to do with dendrites is showing that basically dendrites, even tiny patches of dendrite, 25 micrometers across, has really tremendous kind of information processing capability. And the information processing it's doing is not linear summation like the traditional accepted model. It's doing boolean algebra effectively. It's doing combinatorial logic. When you kind of pair this idea with genes also doing combinatorial logic, do you see the kind of like essential symmetry that is captured between the two? Essentially, you're doing a kind of extended, what's called disjunctive normal form logic between genes and neurons. So once you abstract away the details, then you can show in mathematical formalism at their essence, genes are essentially working in an identical way. That's the dendrites to neurons. Okay, we can explain more how how the axon side of things work with genes and neurons, and also show a similar symmetry.
Way out of interest, a lot of this has come out since your 2016 book. So do I need to recommend the listeners a second edition? Have you updated the book, or is it better that they read the sort of, shall we say, integrating of the new research in a different place?
I think the book covered ground, which is it gives the basis of and there's a chapter on the kind of mathematical formalization of the theory, which that's the kind of like the extension. So no, I mean a future edition of the book won't cover the same ground. It'd be like the extension of where I talk about recursive self-modification, the actual mathematical formalism, which wasn't so developed back then. And I did talk about this idea of kind of like a dendritic processing of, the actual dendritic shape, the tree structure being very relevant for the kind of understanding how neurons work. But recent research has come out, which has really kind of fleshed out that side of thing. I recommend everything in the previous book that I wrote in 2016, but there's a very good book that came out in 2017 called Dendrites, appropriately. Now, it's an absolute telephone directory of a book, but that really kind of beefs up this new view of dendrites, which is basically, it is a view of dendrites, which really is the future of artificial intelligence, is the future of AI.
We're going to be
kind of shortcomings of existing approaches is overcome by this new research.
And we're definitely going to be coming back to AI once we've got all this laid down. So, listeners, you can definitely use the book as a strong reference, and we'll also be referencing some articles based on with this new research into dendritic processing and into genes. Now, I just want to elaborate a little bit because it's so fundamental to the theory. We're not talking about an analogy here, are we? We're talking about self-similarity and recursion over time. Just talk us through these two terms of self-similarity and recursion, just so we can be absolutely clear how this fits into evolution.
Okay. Yes, evolution, I guess, is a very good way of explaining symmetry and also symmetry breaking. Now, recursion is simply this. Okay. Recursion is this process of basically taking some function and basically repeating it again and again. The same kind. Well, compound interest. You can take the idea of compound interest. As we, kind of like depressingly recognize when we look at our bank accounts and our credit card, kind of the compound interest, it keeps kind of like adding on to the previous kind of like the previous debt, so it kind of adds up. Now that's a recursive process. Now, recursive process and symmetry, I guess, with respect to the fractal brain theory and the ideas involved, is this idea of recursively nested symmetry. Now, suppose I take a shape and I basically make smaller copies of that shape, place that shape within itself. then I repeat that, and I recursively take smaller copies of that shape and within those smaller pieces. Then I basically have a shape that's self-similar, that's recursively self-similar. I can take it to infinity. I mean, obviously, natural world objects are not, recursively like kind of like expressed that way to infinity. But say a tree, okay, it branches and the branching pattern keeps going on and on right to a leaf. It's a little bonsai tree. It's like a big tree, and even like a leaf has that same branching pattern of the entire tree. Now, with respect to evolution is essentially have this idea of a tree of life. Evolution is very good for explaining the idea of symmetry. Mathematicians will write books about symmetry, and they'll talk about the same members of a species being in the same symmetry class. So, say a cheetah or, a lion or a hippopotamus, even though every hippopotamus has, infinite variation to every other hippopotamus, there's a symmetry class that's classed as a species. Now, the idea of variation in, again, very important, symmetry breaking. Within that symmetry class of a species, you have variation. And again, this is, if you have invariant aspects, by symmetry breaking and variation, you're breaking the symmetry. So I think evolution is very important for symmetry and also symmetry breaking, also recursively nesting. The idea they have the tree of life, but each kind of taxonomy is recursively nested in an enclosing tree. So it's a very, very easy to visualize and very important, I think, because we think evolution is really, really important theory. And we think that there is a symmetry of a process, this idea that evolution is differentiate, select, amplify. Take the branches of this tree, branches within each species of all these variants, and you differentiate and you select certain ones, obviously natural selection, and you amplify certain branches and certain species and subspecies and certain clans and kind of individuals. We think this is really a fundamental algorithm. We think differentiate, select, amplify is what neurons are doing. We think that's what reinforcement learning circuits are doing. We think we really think that this is a fundamental algorithm to the universe that incorporates ontogenesis, theory of evolution. Obviously, this is the Evo-Devo thing. This is recognized that there's some fundamental intertwining between evolution and ontogenesis. This theory kind of really spells it out in kind of mathematical terms. But we think that symmetry extends to thought behavior and also to the evolution of those thoughts and behaviors. So we really do think there is unified, and this extrapolates to the universe.
Absolutely. And this self-similarity brings us on to the fractal bit. The remarkably simple equations that Benoit Mandelbrot used to create his famous geometric representations in the 80s. Now, just remind us quickly how fractal maths works, and in terms of this symmetrically scaling from large to small, why it's so relevant to this recursive self-modification.
Yeah, I mean, fractal mathematics. Benoit Mandelbrot was the founder. I mean, it's a really hard subject. I mean, towards the end of his death, he said that fractal mathematics is really, really hard. Okay, one of the reasons why I said this is because he attempted a formal definition of what is fractal using a fancy thing called Hausdorff dimensions. We don't have to go into that. But then some fractals appeared. One example is a fractal called the Devil's Staircase, which then didn't fit into his description of what is fractal. So we have this kind of like bewildering description of this incredibly fundamental mathematics, but there's no formal definition for what is a fractal. Okay, textbooks about fractals now, what they're saying is basically there's a gestalt of 5 factors. Okay, they include things like they're generated in a recursive algorithmic way. They have self-similarity. They have a fractal dimension. Where they go these technicalities, but there's this 5 factors. If it satisfies 4 of those factors, then it's a fractal. Now, interestingly, no fractal set, no type of fractal satisfies all 5 factors. Now, I think the real key factor is really self-similarity, even if it's approximate. Now, some authors use the notion of self-symmetry. We think that's really important, self-symmetry, but you might say self-similarity is fuzzy self-symmetry. Do you see how the terms are related? I mean, say his classic Mandelbrot set, which is the most famous fractal of them all. This kind of like simple equation through this recursive processing using billions and billions of iterations on a computer produces this object of infinite complexity. Infinite, you can zoom in as infinite complexity. Well, there's a self-similarity. There's this kind of funny snowman shape. When you look at it on the side, it's like a meditating Buddha if you kind of rotate it. It's like it's like two circles conjoined. Now, it's been proven, like a snowman, body of a snowman, head of a snowman. That snowman shape, okay, is there's a proof. It's just a proof. It's very clever, and the proof shows that there are an infinite number of those snowmen nested within the Mandelbrot set. Absolutely astounding, amazing. Okay, so that's self-similarity, but we think that is really the essence of what is a fractal, this property of self-similarity. And we think that basically this is exactly this idea which really allows us to decode genes and ontogenesis and brains, minds, and neurons in a single, like a single, if you like, snowman shape, a single invariant form. And we can join up all these single invariant forms into a single unified theory. And this, now, respect us. Okay, go for it.
Wade, this concept in fractal mathematics of binary trees and the branching process that appears to sort of be everywhere in life and in the universe. Give us some examples from different contexts, and the listeners can really see these binary trees in action, and they can understand just how all-pervading this principle is.
Well, I mean, binary trees is probably the most simple of all fractals. It is, and probably in nature, when we walk in a park, obviously we see trees everywhere. But in terms of a kind of template and a kind of archetype for what we see around us, then the tree structure in general is probably the most ubiquitous of all things. We talked about the tree of evolution, the trees we see in our gardens, plants, the tree of ontogenesis, a single cell becomes all the cells in your body. That's a tree structure, We can go on to the notion of, a cosmic tree, a single tree of emanation, that the universe also emanates from a point, causing this kind of tree of emanating space, time, etc., and energy and matter. Okay, that's something different. What it is about binary trees is that it is something fundamental. It is something really minimal. Now, Noam Chomsky talks about the what Einstein called miracle creed. When we have the most simple distillation, the most simple answer, then this is where the truth lies. Now, that's with respect to language. We think that there's something really fundamental about binary trees that relates to this thing called discrete mathematics, which maybe we'll elaborate on later. Essentially, trees, and especially binary trees, is absolutely ubiquitous in terms of our bodies and our brains and our minds. Okay, we're saying that basically, cognition, basically how we come about, practically every aspect of the underlying scaffolding in our bodies, it's a binary tree. Now, it sounds like an outrageous statement until I tell you something absolutely obvious. Okay. Basically, your entire life, your body, and all your intelligence, there's a single underlying binary tree emanation underlying it. Okay, that's completely obvious. Why? Because you started from a single fertilized egg. That egg, through mitosis, a binary tree subdivisioning process called mitosis, always binary, always subdividing, has produced every cell in your body. And every neuron in your brain has come about through that process. And every neuron, every dendrite is a binary process, always binary. Every axon is protruding, sending signals out. It's always a binary process. We're saying that binary pattern pertains to language, to music, to not just mitosis, but to what's called progenator fields. So Brian Goodwin, who's one of the big names in developmental biology, he calls ontogenesis a bifurcation diagram. He's not talking about mitosis. He's talking about progenator field formation, how all the different cells become differentiated into different parts of your body. It's a bifurcation diagram. And the idea, the idea that a gene has to have a sense, a genome has to have a sense of space because it has to allocate arms and legs in the right place. Now, the Nobel Prize winning work on the Drosophila fruit fly, of how, the long axis of a Drosophila fruit fly, how does the genome represent space? It does so through this kind of binary kind of allocating of chemical signals, recursively generated over time, and each recursion is a doubling in terms of almost like a frequency wave over space. And through these separate chemicals, each chemical laid on top of one another is a doubling in frequency over the long axis. You represent the entire long axis of the fruit fly in a kind of coordinate frame. Now, this is absolutely astounding kind of like a relationship. If I explain that this is exactly how the brain represents not just what's called allocentric spatial mapping, but also what's called egocentric spatial mapping. Now, the 2012 Nobel Prize winning work, this is absolutely astounding how genome represents space is how the brain does it. The 2012 Nobel Prize winning work on allocentric mapping, okay, it's about grid cells. Okay, cut a long story short, you have these grid cells in your medial temporal lobes, okay, in the dentate gyrus. Let's explain this in the simplest way possible. You basically project a kind of like a periodic grid onto the floor of different kind of scales, and as you walk through a room or some place, then basically these cells will light up. Now, each cell will represent a certain frequency of spacing of these hexagonal or equilateral triangle vertex grids. And now the crucial thing is the scaling factor behind these grids is 1.42, which is the square root of 2. You see, a doubling, halving of these kind of like these grids, which corresponds with this doubling, halving of these chemical signals on a kind of long axis of a Drosophila fruit fly. Now, as for egocentric mapping, what that means is basically, okay, the Nobel Prize winning work was do like a GPS, like being in a certain position in a room. Now, egocentric mapping is essentially the idea that I'm in a certain part of the room, like I can look around. Okay, I'm looking over there, I'm looking over here, I'm looking over here. Now, again, there's a binary subdivision work here. Sometimes we learn how things work when things break down. So there's a thing called hemi-neglect, where you literally lose half your world. Okay, you're going to draw half the cup, only recall half the street. And literally, there's a binary subdivisioning of how you can represent things. Now, okay, suppose I'm looking at a certain egocentric direction that I might lose half of. Now, okay, I keep my kind of like a head fixed on a certain thing. There's what's called saccades. When you look at something, your eye moves. It really moves a lot. There's something called saccades. There's something called microsaccades within those saccades, and there's microsaccades. There's a hierarchy. Now, the really incredible thing is that there are certain lesions, neurological damage that can happen to a certain part of your brain. Okay, one lesion, the hemi-neglect region, your saccades will only go to one side of the visual field. Okay, that's kind of like, well, no. Now, there's a certain kind of lesion. This is really quite phenomenal. Where basically, okay, you have two halves of your visual field. There's one kind of lesion where your saccades, those movements of the eyes, will only go to one side of each half. You've lost half of the half, okay, on one side. Okay, now there's another kind of lesion where basically if you take that same visual field and you divide it into quarters, there's another kind of lesion where you lose one half of each quarter on one side.
It's
you
just
see, recursive, again, binary subdivisioning, exactly how the Drosophila fruit fly work basically subdivides the long axis of the fruit fly to allocate arms and legs and antenna, wings in the right place. We think music, language, structures of cognition, the structures of time. We think that this way of looking at, ontogenesis, all the aspects of thought, all the aspects of ontogenesis, it really covers the kind of like scaffolding on which all the kind of sinew, your skin, all the rest of the framework of your life is superimposed. So we start from something simple, 4 letters of the alphabet. All life reduces to 4 letters of this kind of like genetic alphabet, and we think there's an intermediate algorithmic stage by which this combinatorial code of 4 letters, this binary tree bifurcating into your life, into all your thoughts, everything emanates from that fertilized egg. We think there's a single invariant aspect, this binary tree language, that be captured in this kind of like a formalism of discrete mathematics, which involves binary trees, which can be described by the single unifying process of differentiate, select, amplify, which can be captured in a single new recursively self-modifying calculus, which can then be captured in a single unifying algorithm.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
one of the things that interests me here that I wanted to get your take on is the fact that on the one hand we've got so Goodwin and this evolutionary development, this cell division in a binary process, but then we've also got mutation and epigenetic self-modification happening in a way that deviates from that. So we've got self-similarity, but then we've also got this ability to mutate using the same methodology, but in that sense, mutating in order to slightly change. Now, that's very fractal, isn't it? That it is self-similar and symmetrical, and yet there is a very, very small part of chaos that allows the thing to continue changing and evolving, right?
I guess in ontogenesis there is a stochastic factor. There is a stochastic factor by which genes can randomly be kind of changed during development. Okay, with the epigenetic thing, I think that's more of a kind of pre-programmed kind of change in the way genes work. So I think epigenetics is, in a sense, it is recursive self-modification, because if the genome is like a program, then as ontogenesis unfolds, basically the program is changing itself through these epigenetic mechanisms, acetylation, deacetylation, phosphorylation. You're basically switching certain genes on and off. You're effectively modulating, changing the program. So I think that really touches on something really deep, which is this question of recursive self-modification. And we think that really the essence of how brains work and real essence of intelligence is recursive self-modification. Now, in terms of DNA evolution, there's this very old idea that evolution evolves evolvability. So essentially, the function of evolution is not a static function. Basically, the function recursively self-modifies itself. There's a very kind of very easy to visualize way of illustrating that the power of recursive self-modifying functions and how evolution does this. Now, evolution can be seen on one level as say, what we're taught back in school. I remember, you have this gene, you have the cosmic rays, and kind of like beta particles might knock a kind of nucleotide base, and then you have a kind of gene kind of change. Okay, but the thing is, the thing about evolution is that the previous products of the evolutionary cycle then become the units of future cycles. So in a very simple way, very simple, easy to see way, the function modifies itself. Now, these tiny point mutations can use then mechanisms of a kind of gene insertion deletion, where basically entire strips of DNA can be used as units of future evolution. Then we go on. We know that for a centipede's leg, okay, it has you don't have to re-evolve the leg 100 times. Okay, it's not 100. It's 100, a slightly funny number. But you have that same basic building block and that chunk, and you recursively use it again and again. And I think this is a mechanism in evolution which is basically kind of played out, and it's fundamental to how evolution works: recursively self-modifying functions that augment themselves for future iterations of that same function. We also think it's fundamental to how brains work. And we think artificial intelligence, true artificial intelligence, is necessarily recursively self-modifying. And we think differently from many of the mainstream thinkers. Actually, David Chalmers wrote a consciousness guy about recursive self-modifying kind of AI. We think the level at which recursive self-modification happens is not at the kind of whole brain, kind of like human artificial intelligence, human level artificial intelligence level. We think recursive self-modification is happening at the discrete maths, at the kind of genetic, you know what I'm saying, most minimal level of kind of nucleotides, but also discrete binary tree, the most minimal description. So we think there's this recursively self-modifying bootstrap is happening at this very most minimal level. So by saying this idea about point mutation, and that's where recursive self-modification is being bootstrapped to then gene inserting, deleting whole rows of genes, and then onto more complex things. We think that basically this is really the key to creating a really whole new generation of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, and we're about to get into that. But just before we get into this, unfortunately, a philosophical minefield of consciousness, the nature of reality, and also about the development of AI. Just to be really, really clear for the listeners, because there's we've just given them a lot of information. Can you just briefly, in a couple of phrases, summarize the fractal brain theory based on what we've just said before we get into the really, really brain squeezing stuff of consciousness.
Yeah, so we think in the same way, like like Einstein celebrated E equals mc squared, or the electromagnetic spectrum ideas of, because it's unifying of two separate phenomena: mass, energy, electricity, magnetism, light. We think the same pertains to these two fundamental properties that we see in the universe and around us, of life and intelligence. We think that from the neurons having the symmetry relationship with genes, gene regulatory networks, neuronal networks, genomes of brains, and ontogenesis to thought and behavior, and the kind of like the more quite widely accepted idea of evolution and learning and creativity. We think that there exists this perfect symmetry between the two. We also think that basically there is a deeper unification, because a genome will create a body, then create a brain. So in a sense, there is this kind of like stacking of genomics creating a body and brain, and then this brain evolving, thoughts and behavior, and then those thoughts and behavior evolving. We think from the very beginning of a fertilized egg, there is a single process, a single, unifying theory. But then that unifying theory also accounts for how the details of the genome evolved in the first place. And that really, this process begins not from the level of genes or neurons, it starts from a level of bits. And we think that there's a kind of like a description in terms of discrete mathematics of formal axiomatic systems, and especially this idea of recursively self-modifying formal axiomatic systems that at the very most minimal can then unfold into this theory. It's basically, it's a new calculus. It is essentially this idea that the traditional mathematics, Leibniz and Newton's calculus, and kind of like analytic geometry, which really kind of like practically 99% of all science uses this kind of continuous mathematics with these differential equations. We think that basically it's an impediment, and that when one example, Eric H. Davidson, his team, he wrote quite clearly, a Caltech professor, that his team used these differential equations to describe genomic regulatory processes. He said that when he shifted to Boolean algebra, then suddenly everything made sense. It was a clarity involved. We think that same kind of process, that same argument extends to all the rest of it. It's like a unifying theory, but it uses this kind of new way of looking at discrete mathematics, coupled with this recursively self-modifying bootstrap mechanism.
And out of interest, Wei, are you collaborating with a mathematician on this, or are you pushing out all of these new equations yourself?
Do you know, I mean, these ideas are really they go against the grain of the mainstream. Like Geoffrey Hinton, the neural network, godfather of neural networks. He kind of looks back and then how he says for years his approach for decades was basically on the sidelines of the artificial intelligence community. So it was support vector machines, expert systems, and kind of what's called decision trees. Now it's all the rage. What we're saying is basically this whole vector matrix multiplication way of doing AI doesn't correspond to real neurons. It's just not the way things are. So really, we are basically something outside of the mainstream, kind of theoretical neuroscience AI world. But people who attend my talks, on my LinkedIn and my Facebook, include MIT professors. So it's gaining traction, but it's outside the mainstream. But when people hear the ideas, hear the clarity, hear the power, even though it's completely different from the mainstream, people see the rhyme and reason, the sense behind it. So I think it will gain traction.
My question, Wei, is more, are these equations in your work, in your papers, or have you found mathematicians who are interested in this new approach to discrete mathematics who are collaborating to help you thrash it out? That's my question.
Oh yeah. No. This is completely something that happens in the mind of a single individual, I believe. In terms of what's happening in the mainstream, I can tell you that Gregory Chaitin, who's one of the top names in discrete mathematics, in kind of logical mathematics, or does a lot of work with Gödel's theorem. He's a very smart guy. He has proposed in his book Metamaths, he's proposed this notion of a dynamic formal axiomatic system. Because there is a question of what's the simplest, most formal axiomatic system, which isn't very interesting, is it? I mean, it could be very simple and do not very much. But there is a very interesting question of what is the simplest, most possible formal axiomatic system that can generate all the other formal axiomatic systems, which means all mathematics. As Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead showed, all mathematics reduces to set theory, and then it's essentially discrete mathematics, and all kind of it reduces further to formal axiomatic systems. This is the question of, how does a single kind of formal axiomatic system generate all mathematics, essentially? So it's a very deep question. Now, Gregory Chaitin is at the cutting edge. He asks the question, is there a dynamic formal axiomatic system? Essentially, where does mathematics come from? But he doesn't really have the answer. He just poses the question. What I think I'm doing is basically I am filling in the details. And my answer also happens to be the mathematizing, the distilling of a wider theory about life and intelligence. I know that's a huge claim to make. But, Noam Chomsky has asked this question of the universal grammar and what's called the minimalist program. What's the most minimal distillation of that which can generate all human language? Now, I'd make a very interesting point here. Now, there's no sharp demarcation between human language on one hand and mathematical language, is there? Simply because of the fact that you can say all this mathematical language, you can say it in human language. It might be very verbose, funny Greek symbol, bracket, curly bracket, etc. But you can say it. So what we think is that when you take the most minimal universal grammar, the most minimal distillation of universal grammar, the most minimal formal axiomatic system that can generate all the other formal axiomatic systems, that most minimal universal grammar that can generate all human language, it's the same point. And we think this is also the ultimate distillation of this life intelligence theory. And I think that is really the thing which can really just impress a lot of people. And I think that is where things are heading.
The reason I ask, Wei, is because there may well be some listeners out there who, convinced by your ideas, might be wanting to check the equations themselves. And I'm just wondering if the book is the best place to look for those equations, or where could the listeners find your reinterpretation of this differential calculus?
The book is really the kind of best starting point for this. Really.
So it's got the maths in there. Okay, that's what I wanted to check for the listeners. The maths is in that book.
It's got a kind of the basics. I mean, really, the maths we're talking about is not the kind of maths that mathematicians can use. Let me explain. Let me explain this. A kind of proof written in set theory will be 10 times the length of a proof written in normal mathematics. So normal mathematics, what we're familiar with is basically, say, a 10-page proof in set theory would be 100 pages. Now, in this abstract language, that same proof is going to be like 1,000 pages, but the language is going to be little binary trees and kind of like at right angles at certain points, and kind of space-time binary trees. Now, it's not a practical language for mathematicians to use, but it's the perfect kind of language for computers to process. So, really, the theory really finds its form in an algorithmic expression. So it really finds its form directly in the expression of computer code, which is where the work is concentrated on now. So instead of having differential equations and then converting it into computer code and doing numerical analysis, and then the CPUs, the compilers, will translate those differential equations ultimately to the boolean algebra that's being processed by the actual circuits on the CPU, the actual microchips. Rather directly, this theory is actually dealing directly with the Boolean algebra and the micro constituents of this discrete mathematics.
We're going to come back to that computer science shortly, aren't we? But let's get into the juicy, difficult stuff while we've still got time. Now, you believe that the easy problems of consciousness, namely how these neural correlates of conscious phenomena are accounted for in terms of sort of computational and neural activities in the nervous system, is more parsimoniously accounted for by fractal brain theory than by other current theories like higher order emergence or brainwave coherence or information theory or Darwinian competition. Perhaps you could explain first how fractal theory would account for that, and then compare it to a few of these other favorites in the field, like emergence or Darwinian competition.
I think what you're talking about is the so-called easy problem of consciousness, and find the correlator. What are the correlators? And all these different people have their pet correlators. This is my favorite correlator, whether it's kind of brainwave coherence, that's the correlator. It's information, that's the correlator. David Chalmers wrote about kind of dual aspect information theory, and what became fashionable about 10 years ago was what's called integrated information theory. So something to do with information, it's something to do with hierarchical structures, it's something to do with even the theory of evolution that is the correlator one author kind of proposed. So there's always different kind of pet candidates: global workspace theory, theories of attention, and the kind of quantum theories, Penrose and Hameroff, most closely associated. What we think is that this kind of symmetry theory that distills intelligence and life into this kind of very compact, kind of like formal axiomatic system, recursively sub-modifying format, it contains all these separate pet correlators as facets of this unified theory. So the correlator is not these separate, kind of views, these separate fashionable or kind of pet theories of various researchers. They are kind of like views on this kind of master correlator. Let's call it master correlator. It's like instead of seeing different parts of the camel, we're saying this is the entire camel. That the correlator is itself that distilled theory which captures all these separate aspects of life and intelligence. So I think that is the unified kind of, I guess, solution to the easy problem of consciousness. And I think it's very compelling. I think once the theory is widely accepted, I think this is really the solution to the easy problem that will satisfy all these, well, not completely satisfy, but in some sense, all these different theorists will find something in it for them because it kind of captures all their separate pet theories.
And many of the neuroscientists that I've had on the show, they simply laugh kindly when I consider other possibilities, possible assumptions regarding the origin of consciousness or the potential primacy of consciousness to physical matter. And they cite very famous examples like alcohol physiologically leading to the state of drunkenness, or anesthetics leading to somebody losing consciousness. Tell us some of the interesting ideas coming out of physics and philosophy that relate to your model that you think are sort of begging us to reevaluate this intuition that the brain simply generates phenomenal consciousness. And I'd like to start with one of your best examples, the possibility that time can flow backwards as well as forwards, an idea that was elaborated in time-symmetric quantum mechanics. Now, what is time-symmetric quantum mechanics, and what does it mean for these causal chains that physicalism uses to prove that the brain is producing these states?
This is really, really important because, the physicalist, materialist reductionists, they'll say basically, of course, the brain arises from... the brain arises from ontogenesis, but then consciousness arises from the brain. Now, the proponent over the years has really kind of pushed this idea and expressed it again and again. It's John Searle, the leading philosopher, who has said, yeah, of course, how can it be any other way? Look, I hit myself on the head and it's causing myself to feel pain of that. Therefore, there's a causal link between getting hit on the head and my feeling of pain. I drink this alcohol, and then there's a causal link. I drank the alcohol, the molecules of alcohol go into my brain. I'm feeling drunk. So it's an open and shut case. How can it be any other way? Okay, and there is new findings which actually show that there is a completely different way of looking at things, which argue for exactly the not the opposite, but it kind of really shows that basically. Cause and consequence are not really kind of like privileged views at all. That really there's another view. Okay, we know that all the laws. This has been known for forever. That all the laws of physics, quantum mechanics, Newton's laws, Einstein's general relativity, they're time reversible. They work equally well forwards in time or backwards in time. Now, okay, there is a very interesting idea from Jacques Haronoff, who's a very kind of distinguished scientist. He was a front runner for the 2009 Nobel Prize for Physics, according to Reuters. He won the 2010 the U.S. Presidential Medal for Science, very prestigious. Okay. His idea is basically he's supposing something very obvious and also I think very powerful. If all the laws of physics are time reversible, okay, we have this thing called quantum mechanics, and we have this idea of looking at quantum mechanics evolving forwards in time. So these Schrödinger wave equations, they go forwards in time, they diverge in all these parallel universes and parallel superpositions, forwards in time. He's just basically saying, if all the laws of physics are time reversed, why shouldn't it not be the case that there's a symmetrical, a kind of inverse version, a kind of destiny wave function emanating from the future? So that's in essence what time-symmetric quantum mechanics is about. It's very elegant. It's very, very, I think, very powerful. And there's been some prominent physicists like Paul Davies have dug up his idea. Well, not dug it up. He's kind of like, the idea was formulated about 40 years ago, but since he's won these prizes, I mean, people, I guess, been taking more notice of his ideas. But what we think is really powerful, it just means that basically, if there really is this kind of destiny wave function, he calls it, not my words, his words, destiny wave function, which is pulling the kind of like a universe to a set conclusion, and also world history to a set conclusion, it means that basically cause and consequence are just one way of looking at things. There's also a way of looking at things which is destiny and necessity. It is the opposite. So basically, they're on equal status. There's other work from loop quantum gravity and what's called string theory or membrane theory, which are two leading contenders of grand unified theory of the universe. And okay, interestingly, both these string theory and loop quantum gravity, they're both individually, separately, kind of come up with this idea.
They removed time. Yeah, they removed it from the equations. We spoke to Carlo Rovelli about this, listeners, that he just said it was far more parsimonious to take time out of it because of this reversal question.
Well, yeah, and supporting time-symmetric quantum mechanics. I mean, these two theories are supposing there's a pre-Big Bang epoch that's a mirror image of this epoch. And this idea that if you take a mirror image, that means there's a thing called CPT symmetry, where if you reverse polarity, then basically you have to flip time, and you have to flip, charge becomes anti-charge, antimatter becomes matter, matter becomes antimatter. Anyway, it means that basically this pre-Big Bang epoch, it means that basically it goes with this idea of a big bounce, that essentially we are bouncing back to the origin. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it means that basically in this pre-Big Bang epoch, time is flowing the other way. It's just basically cause and causality, cause and consequence is just one way of looking at things. It's not privilege at all. There's an equally kind of valid way of seeing things in terms of destiny and necessity. It means that what we have is correlation. It means we have not matter, brain necessarily causes consciousness. What we have definitely is correlation. Now, okay, so if you have a master correlator, then this leads us neatly on to the hard problem of consciousness. And in some ways, it's really neat because David Chalmers, in a recent 2017 paper, Idealism and the Mind-Body Problem, he's really set out the terms of how idealism, the alternative to materialist, physicalist reductionism, can work. So we think this is really where the answer lies. I mean, for your listeners, I've been kind of really watching some of your videos and actually surveying all the people you've interviewed so far. This is going to be very interesting for your listeners because, okay, outside of the kind of like a physicalist, materialist, reductionist camp, there's a common factor behind all the other guests you've interviewed, whether it's, quantum mechanics, the idealists, or people tending towards ontological idealism, even like psychedelic interviewees, the near-death experience people. There's basically Joseph Campbell, even Carl Gustav Jung. There's a common factor behind all of it. Okay, and I'll tell you what the common factor is. And the common factor, David Chalmers, in his 2017 paper, he's called it identity. Okay, cosmo-psychism, that's what he's called it. And we think basically this common factor is the answer, and this answer also happens to be the most controversial idea in all the annals of world history, and it's plausibly, arguably, the most controversial idea in the universe, and we think this is the answer, and we think we can show in a very convincing way that this answer is right.
Okay, so talking about informational representation there, you're talking about the idealists and how this is really coming to the fore. It brings us to the ideas, some of which you may have seen, Wei, on the show we did with Don Hoffman, of the physical world as a sort of evolutionary dashboard, a user interface. User interface evolved to maximize these evolutionary fitness payoffs, and other ideas from Bernardo Kastrup, of a sort of dissociative boundary that the user interface provides that separates our psyche from this wider field of energy exchange, what he calls the mind at large. And your work takes us tentatively in this sort of consciousness's fundamental direction, doesn't it? Tell us how you've arrived there.
Right, right. It's most interesting. I mean, Donald Hoffman. I saw a Lex Friedman interview, and he described his near-death experience connecting to one of the other speakers, and he described how in this near-death experience he experienced something that and to articulate it. I mean, I know you mentioned Upanishads, the summing up the Vedas in the interview he did with you. Okay, so how does this take on things relate to how do we basically extrapolate from these ideas into this idea of a unified theory of consciousness and solve the hard problem? That's what you're asking, isn't it?
Yeah,
okay.
And I'm interested how you got there. Like, how did your data take you in that direction? I'm interested in the sort of logical steps.
Okay. The logical step is basically the idea of identity cosmo-psychism is the idea that essentially that there is this cosmic consciousness. You might want to call it God, you might want to call it something different. The totality of all existence.
Bernardo just calls it nature, which I rather liked. He said, I just prefer a nice neutral phrase like nature.
Yeah, which is something that German romantic philosophers would totally have been into, who were very into nature, but also into the Upanishads, very into the corpus mescum at the same time. I mean, no, totally. It is a different view on the same thing. We think that in terms of logical starting point, basically what we have is a system of is a way of looking at things that starts from the only certainty you can possibly have, which is one consciousness. Okay, this is obviously ground that's been trodden by René Descartes, the father of Western philosophy, and Immanuel Kant, the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers. They both followed similar reasoning paths that they cannot know, what the external reality is, physical reality, the noumenal world, Kant called it. It's basically, you can only really know, I think, therefore I am. What he's saying is basically, I can only know my first person subject to reality. That's the only thing I can ever know. That's the only thing you've ever known. Is one consciousness. So how do we go from there to explaining how that one consciousness can then explain the universe, all the other consciousnesses, even the laws of physics? Okay, that's really the question. Now, this is very good because David Chalmers, in his papers, laid it out for us, who can follow in quite neat steps the problems he says is the case with this idea of identity cosmo-psychism. And then what the problems are. So we can go through step by step in a very short space of time, actually, and then we actually just nail it. Okay, that's what we think we can do. Okay, so firstly, he says the first immediate objections to identity cosmo-psychism, he says the first one is that basically he says that we are distinct from each other. So therefore, how can it possibly be that we are all identical to this cosmic consciousness, nature, whatever we want to call it, or and then a second objection. He's saying basically that this cosmic consciousness is presumably, he says, having all these amazing experiences that we're not having. He says, okay, firstly, the first point, the simple fact of the matter is that we are distinct from ourselves. It's not that we are distinct from each other. We are distinct from ourselves, but that doesn't stop us from the notion that we are the same identity throughout our lives. Now, when I was a little kid, I was actually thinking in Chinese. I was living in Ipswich. Obviously, my life was very different, but I'm the same person. So the first objection is just irrelevant. The second objection that this cosmic consciousness is having amazing experiences. Okay, one, he contradicts it later on in his paper because he says there's an austerity problem, that the cosmic consciousness seems very much like the laws of physics. Okay, there's counter arguments to that too, that baby's brain seems very austere, doesn't have any rationality. That baby might grow into an Einstein or Michelangelo. Okay, but the other point with the second objection is that what does he base his presumption on? Well, nothing. You can't really assume you've not had a oneness experience with this cosmo consciousness. You're making assumptions out of thin air. You're just saying, oh yeah, there's this cosmic consciousness. Therefore, it must. There's reasons to think that the cosmic consciousness is having similar experiences to us, and the reason for this is then what he is basically outlining as the three main problems in explaining it, and he calls them the constitution problem and the three sub-constitution problems. So let's go for this in a space of a few minutes, because we can really nail it. Okay, so the first point is the first 2 points is what he calls the kind of the quality constitution problem and the structural constitution problem. He's saying basically, if there is a cosmic consciousness, then how does that constitute the experiential structure of these macro consciousness he calls us, all these sentient beings in the universe? And then he's saying, how does the qualia, essentially, of these macro consciousness, how can it possibly have a kind of cosmic consciousness? How can its qualities constitute our qualities? Okay, well, simple, because if there really is this fractal self-similar brain theory that is absolutely special and absolutely has to be the case throughout the universe, that solves the kind of like the structural constitution problem, because it's fractal. It necessarily has to be the same fractal structure as us, just on a different scale. Now, this idea of organizational variance, I assume you have the same kind of experience that I do, because your brain is roughly similar to me and similar to mine. Basically, we have this thing called scale invariant organizational variance. It just means basically this cosmic consciousness has the same kind of structure in its mind that we do, because it's fractal. That then we can then extrapolate that the same qualities of that consciousness would be through organizational variance to mine. Okay, so that's the first 2 problems solved through this kind of fractal consciousness, fractal brain theory extrapolating the universe. Now, the third problem, which he says is impossible, he says it can't be solved. He says there's arguments that is impossible. He doesn't say what they are, but he says, the third one is identity, the identity constitution problem. How does a cosmic consciousness, the identity of consciousness, be one with the identity of this consciousness, you and me, all the kind of sentient beings in the universe? There is a solution, and it's utterly simple, and it starts with the assumption of one consciousness, the only thing you can never know. It's simply this. It's simply, if you take the idea that basically reality is illusory, that's what idealism is saying. It doesn't exist. What's the nature of that existence? It is information. Okay, so many kind of physicists accept that information can be a substrate for the universe. Now, is that information shaped? Now, okay, another idea which has made a comeback is this notion that the universe is mathematical. So we think that the Mandelbrot set is a very simple mathematical equation, and it can basically describe a universe of infinity within it. We think this is a very ancient idea, that there is essentially a mathematical construct, a form that can describe the entire universe, essentially that the universe exists mathematically. Now, this has been resurrected by Max Tegmark, the MIT physicist, quoting people like Pythagoras and kind of many scientific luminaries. In the same way that a mathematical model will shape the information on a graphics card to produce virtual reality, we think that this kind of mathematical equation of the universe is shaping thermodynamics, i.e. information, to configure states of thermodynamic states that correspond to this master correlator. Okay, so now as we traverse through space, then this master correlator is essentially weaving through your head now, and that's your subjective state. Okay. Now, you take this kind of like every life in the universe as a kind of thread, okay, of kind of this master correlator from birth to death, kind of weaving through space-time. And each of those threads is the master correlator weaving through a lifetime. And then, okay, here is the controversial part. Okay, now, if I am consciousness, I am the one consciousness, and it's the only thing I can ever know, then how do I account for all the other consciousness if external reality is illusory? It doesn't really exist. How does existence, consciousness, arise from non-existence, i.e. mathematics and information? It doesn't. But then how can I account for all the other consciousness? The answer is utterly simple. And it's, back to the miracle creed, the simplest answer is probably the right answer. You basically take all these threads of consciousness of every sentient being, every macro consciousness, whether the human consciousness, planetary consciousness, or the consciousness whose body is the entire universe, and you join all these threads, one life for birth to death, you join all the threads into one continuous thread. And it just means that your consciousness at this point in time, any viewer watching this in this point of time, yes, you are this kind of point in the universe, but at any point on this chain, you can experience yourself being the entire universe, and it's to experience things as they really are. And this is the intersection of all these ideas. Carl Gustav Jung was into it, Schrödinger, all these, everything outside of materialist, physicalist reductionism, that is the common factor. And if you can actually, articulate it just in a very short space of time, obviously we're going to elaborate at length, then this really is the minimal rational explanation. It sounds wild and crazy, but it's absolutely reasonable. Okay, based on the only assumption you're going to know, there is a proof. There is a proof to this idea. Okay, scientists will say nothing can ever be proven. Yes, there is. There is a proof on that which is doing the proving. There's the proof which can be performed, an experiment that can be performed on the observer. And this is one of the, some of your talks basically talk about this, psychedelics. It's always been one of the pathways. It's a very quick, slightly dangerous actually pathway. It's always been there. The Christian Eucharist, all these kind of like world religions have these psychedelics in their background. And there's also these mystic paths, Tantra, Vajrayana, all these kind of paths which lead people to this truth. And that is the proof. The proof is the experience of being the universe or nature. Okay, I've avoided that three-letter word, haven't I?
Very good. Very good. You don't have to avoid it. God is a perfectly respectable word, as Ian McGilchrist picked me up on it. And he said, listen, we don't want to make God into something we can't talk about. But sorry that we have to move on, Wade, because we're coming to the end of our time. But listeners, do go and check. Yeah. Way's got a new talk on his YouTube channel, lots of interesting elaboration of his ideas on that YouTube channel, and you can pick up this picking apart that Way does of David Chalmers' important paper, which I'll be linking in the show notes, as well as his YouTube channel as well. So you can get more detail if you go back to Way's talks on that. Now, I've got to get something on artificial intelligence into this way. You are a computer scientist first, so you must, like everybody else in the field, particularly at the moment with all this chat about bots and chatbots, you must have wondered if AI could be truly self-reflective, could be an artificial consciousness. I've always felt that if we ever got to that level, that it was so good at imitating our peculiar type of metaconsciousness that we couldn't tell the difference, perhaps even so good that even it couldn't tell the difference, and it believed it itself, it still wouldn't quite be conscious in the way we are. But if you're suggesting that there is an algorithm of life and intelligence, presumably one could program such an entity if you had the mathematical information about that algorithm. Where do you stand on this conscious AI debate? And perhaps you've changed your position over the years.
We're really getting into some really interesting, deep questions. Okay, yeah. I mean, on the self-reflective AI thing, we think that there is a very good answer. We think there's a good answer from neuroscience that's actually emerged in the past 10 years. I mean, literally very new. I remember reading the famous Douglas Hofstadter book years ago, Goodwin Bark. He says this thing about jumping out of the system, he calls it, that, we can't jump out of ourselves no, he's saying that AI can't jump out of itself to analyze itself. That's what he's saying. But we think a new generation of AI can do it. We know we do it. We know, in a sense, we do jump out of ourselves. We kind of like think about ourselves thinking. We can keep jumping out of ourselves, recursively jumping out. Now, how do we do that? Is it like a little homunculus, a little man, an infinite regressive little man? Of course not. So we're doing it, but how do we do it? We think the answer has emerged from the studies of this part of the brain called the polar frontal cortex. Okay. Now, for years, even luminaries of neuroscience have said there's no difference in fundamental architecture between a brain and a chimpanzee or any other, higher mammal, let's say, or higher primate. But recent research, literally, that's appeared in the past 10, at most 15 years, has really nailed it and has shown that there's a specific pattern of wiring from this polar frontal cortex to the rest of the brain. Now, what does this polar frontal cortex do? And I can explain in a compact form why it's the case that this part of the brain will allow us to do jumping up the system and self-reflection. Now, conventional research from MRI scans and conventional neuroscience studies has long established that what this part of the brain is doing is multitasking. So you do many things at once. This part of the brain is engaged. It's also involved in cognitive looping. So I think about one thing, there's a kind of cognitive task, then I move back to that. Okay. Now, how do computers, explains by way of analogy, how does a computer do multitasking, okay, or cognitive branching? It uses what's called a memory stack. So it's doing one task, then it takes a snapshot, system state of that task, and it puts on a memory stack, then it does the other task, or the subtask. And then when we finish that task, it basically takes the previous task off the stack and can keep stacking things, etc. We think we can see from the connections of the polar frontal cortex to the memory areas and to the spatial mapping areas, the single bundle back to the what's called the retrosplenial cortex and all these medial entorhinal cortex structures, that essentially all the structures are there to implement this kind of stack feature. And because of where it's situated at the very apex of all the apexes, the language apex, the visual apex, all these cognitive apexes, is at the apex of apexes. It's in the position to take that system snapshot of the entire brain. Okay. Now, look, instead of thinking about cognitive branching and multitasking, now if I take a snapshot of my system state, okay, I'm thinking of something. Okay, then I take a snapshot and put it on a stack, memory stack. Okay, now what if the subtask is to actually then to examine what's on the stack? Okay, I'm not doing multitasking or cognitive branching. The actual, the subtask is to actually look at the snapshot. It means I can think about something. Then with my polar frontal cortex and its connections to the memory centers and spatial processing centers, I can take a snapshot, put it on the stack. But now I look at the stack. So I think about something, take the snapshot, and now I can think about myself thinking about something. I can take a snapshot of that.
That seems like a really, really simple computer science technique to create metaconsciousness. No, I take a snapshot, I have a memory, and I ask the AI to then self-reflect about that memory. Surely that's something that AI technicians have been experimenting with for quite a while.
Oh, you'd be surprised. I mean, meta processing really is at the cutting edge of, really, there's no satisfactory solution.
Right.
And when we think about, when people talk about meta processing, say DeepMind, what they're talking about is just kind of the frontal lobes controlling the dopamine system. This is something completely different. We think that this work on the polar frontal cortex hasn't really filtered through yet into the wider kind of AI community yet. So you'd be surprised. And I think in terms of, if you really want to create human level AI, I think the best way to do it is really through reverse engineering. That in fact we're having all this kind of like wealth of data from the polar frontal cortex studies. I think allows us then to kind of reverse engineer the entire brain. Now, the question you're asking, is it conscious, which is David Chalmers' zombie, the famous zombie thing? Yes, it can be self-reflect, and we can see that it's jumping out the stack. It's kind of like seems to be reflecting on itself, taking snapshots of itself, jumping out of itself, etc. Doing kind of Douglas Hoff stuff, that's jumping out the system. Now, is it conscious? And I think the answer is not necessarily so. Okay, no. How can I say that? Because what I believe. Now, if we really do believe that there really is that reality is illusory, that physical existence doesn't really exist, it exists in the same way mathematics exists, and this mathematical equation configures thermodynamics, these information states which don't really exist, into states which correspond to the master correlator, and then consciousness, which does exist, then maps to these thermodynamic states, which are configurations of the master correlator. Okay, so what we think is that basically, existence doesn't arise from non-existence, information and the physical universe, which we think exists as a mathematical object. We think that basically that what's an idea that's not fashionable, that in the consciousness crowd, I remember people took a vote on it, and it was basically this idea of Penrose's idea of collapse of the wave function. Now, the original founders of quantum mechanics would have been totally resonant with Penrose's idea and to see what Hameroff saw there. I think where the fault lies is basically they concentrate too much on microtubules, and maybe the details of what they're saying is, where the wave function collapses is not so important. The fact of the matter is, ultimately, the description of the universe is quantum mechanical. But at the same time, the physical universe we inhabit is not a kind of multiverse of diverging possibilities. And the consciousness I experience, these qualia, is not a divergence of many kind of different states at once. It is one consciousness and one state of configuration of qualia. We think that basically the Einstein's hidden variables, this collapse of the wave function, is we have to ask, what is the uncollapsed wave function? And we think that basically, if this idea that the equations of quantum mechanics are pointing towards something, they are mathematical formalisms basically, but they are basically pointing towards something far, far bigger. And it is Einstein's hidden variables, but we think the hidden variables are far bigger than just like it is. It is the totality of all existence. Now, Penrose says that the existing formulation of quantum mechanics is incomplete exactly because of this problem of collapse of the wave function. That basically it is a kind of probabilistic reduction of these waves into one. But why? Now some physicists will be satisfied. Oh yeah, it is. It's just a random process. But Einstein wasn't content with that. And Penrose isn't content with that. Now, what we think is basically it is not random. We think that basically there is this kind of like totality of all existence, and that these wave functions kind of like just intimations, little kind of like glimpses into this thing that's far, far bigger, and that the actual collapse of the wave function is actually like. It is collapsing into a particular configuration of a kind of like thermodynamic states in my brain corresponding to the qualia. But the uncollapsed wave function is that which really is that which you really are. So I think back to nature, back to God, back to this totality of all existence. And I think basically we are essentially the totality of all existence reflecting on itself eternally through this eternal passage.
Bring that back to AI way.
Yeah, I'm about to. So that means that basically I don't think conventional computers with finite mathematical descriptions can ever be conscious, because you can never capture the infinite in the finite. But what I believe is that there is almost like a hand-in-glove mapping between this theory that involves bits and binary trees and binary combinatorial codes and qubits. So even though I think conventional computers will never be conscious, I think basically a computer that can actually configure itself and actually take advantage of this kind of like this quantum world interfaces with this quantum world, this uncollapsed wave function, I think that is where consciousness can be created in a computer.
Yeah,
and I think that's what biological neurons are actually doing. Not necessarily microtubules, but I think the entire brain. Okay, all physical reality is ultimately quantum mechanical. So I think basically the entire brain, this kind of master correlator, is also ultimately quantum mechanical. But in terms of qualia states, it's a collapse into the wave function. So I think Penrose is absolutely right, even if the microtubules might not necessarily be the case.
Absolutely. And listeners, you must go back to our episode on quantum biology, where we speak to John Joe McFadden about where there really is a lot of evidence that there are quantum processes happening in biology, even if not quite in the way that Penrose and Hameroff theorized all those years.
Right.
And just bring it back to AI then. So AI would also be recursively self-modifying in that sort of sense, and would be completely adaptable. And in that sense, could evolve in any way that it chose. Isn't that opening the door to some of the greatest fears in AI development at the moment, that AI could become self-protective, self-defensive, in such a sense that if it had access to military technology, it could at some point say, actually, you're the enemy now? Aren't we opening the doors to uncontrollable possibilities if we're programming AI in this way?
Yeah, that's a very kind of like this kind of talk. These kind of ideas make the headlines. I mean, like
Max Tegmark is leading a very, very nuanced conversation about this, where he's saying, listen, this isn't about AI; it's about what we're doing with it. But the bottom line is even if we outlaw this, even if we can get some consensus on killer bots, just recently South America have come together in a massive agreement. Unfortunately, the United Nations haven't managed to arrive to this agreement, but the South American countries have just agreed on this to ban this technology. Even if there was a UN agreement, I think they would go ahead and develop it in secret anyway, in order to avoid some kind of military gap with any competition. I mean, are you worried about this as you're thinking about these very new approaches to AI?
Well, okay. Essentially, the question really boils down to two things, which I think are not as discussed, and I think it boils down to the nature of human ethics and morality. Obviously, that's a huge question.
That's a
Okay.
big one.
I mean, but I think there is a resolution to that question. It's Nietzsche's question, isn't it? Basically, you've done away with religion. Now, what's the basis of your new morality and ethics? And he kind of presciently kind of predicted nihilism, which is the state of the world today. Okay, okay, it's a bit extreme, but I think it was right. The other huge question, obviously, is control. Okay, we'll tackle the first question first. Is about how do you control these AIs? We think basically there is an answer, and it's found in the brain. Okay. We have this amazing computing technologies, polar frontal cortexes, recursive self-modification, Einstein abilities, and Leonardo, Michelangelo reasoning abilities and creative abilities. Do you know, I tell you for a fact that all these abilities are subservient to a tiny part of a primitive part of the brain called a hypothalamus. And you can see in the brain, there's really kind of like almost like a fail-safe kind of safety lock, kind of like safety catch mechanisms. And there's a multitude of them layered on top of these kind of higher cognitive mechanisms. It's very hard to override the hypothalamus. There's a fallacy that somehow we are these logical creatures, and then somehow there's this kind of like emotional part of the brain. Essentially, reason, human creativity subserves this kind of animal hypothalamus amygdala part of the brain, which is to do with pleasure and pain, fear and desire. Okay, well, we think that it is a problem of control. You create these AIs, you don't create an AI. Look, I'm going to let the AI run this weapon factory that creates kind of the military AIs, and they can do the ordering, control their own power supply. Obviously, you don't do that. So you mesh from the outset your AIs into a control structure. It's nothing, it's not a kind of wild proposition that humans spend inordinate amounts of time controlling other humans. It's not kind of like so far-fetched to suppose we must express and use a lot of time to control our creations. AI is like a nuclear power. You can run amok. You can have a nuclear disaster. You can create an atom bomb with it. But if you can control it, then the power is immense. And I think it's not something we can ignore. Okay, on the ethical question, it will happen basically. Basically, we just have to really control it. On the ethical question, a military AI, people say it's an engineering problem. It's not. It basically is about human ethics. If your society advocates genocide, which was the case, it's not hypothetical. There have been genocidal societies and ideologies. Then the AI you create is going to be genocidal. So it's not an engineering problem. It's basically to do with human ethics. It's to do with human morality, and also the idea of like a war AI, AI for war. It's not such a clear-cut question. Try to explain to the war widow whose husband has been recently deceased that he can't use AI to take soldiers off the battlefield. You know what I'm saying? And you got like countries with diminishing populations where there's going to be less soldiers need to defend themselves. I think it's a moral question whether it's not it's immoral to create kind of weapons AI. It might be the case in some situations. Okay, I'll qualify this. That it's going to be immoral not to create AI. I know it's a sad state of affairs, but we're living in a kind of world of conflict, and so that leads us to the moral question. Okay, I do give entire talks about this. We think Nietzsche's problem. He says basically, yes, we've done away with the basis of religion, and he says that's the basis of your ethics and morality is in the translations for English by no means obvious what those foundations are. Okay, to cut a long story short, this is going to maybe alienate some people, but we think that the moral basis, and this is actually what some militant atheist philosophers and thinkers and atheist thinkers think anyway, that there really is this kind of like a kind of metaphysical, cosmological basis to morality, the ideas of progress, human dignity, sanctity of human life, equality, that rest in assumptions which are essentially spiritual and religious. And we think ultimately that these assumptions directly relate to the solution to the mystery of consciousness, that the human dignity derives from the idea that we are all this one all-pervasive consciousness that you may or may not want to call God, and that equality derives from the fact that ultimately we are not just of one flesh, we are of one soul, and that progress derives from the fact that there is progress in society, in the universe, and it's woven in Freeman Dyson, that mind and intelligence are woven into the fabric of the universe that somehow surpasses all understanding. Roger Penrose sticking his neck out, saying that basically Platonic values, the good, that's what it means, are somehow woven into the quantum matrix. We absolutely believe this, and by re-establishing the cosmological foundations and the metaphysical foundations for morality and ethics, that is the ultimate solution to dangerous genocidal AI.
Wow, what a fascinating way to wrap up today's conversation, Wei. And I shall certainly be linking to Wei's talks on this, because that's an entire hour and a half conversation just in itself. But interesting, you're able to make this jump. And I wasn't aware that Penrose had done so too. So I shall certainly be looking into that. So it remains just for me to thank you so much, Wei, for giving us a bit of a insight into fractal brain theory and how it can be applied and how ubiquitous it is. And I'm really, really happy that for a multidisciplinary thinker like yourself, you're getting traction and people are starting to take it seriously. So listeners, do go off if you're interested in understanding this in a lot more depth, the Fractal Brain Theory book. And also we're going to be linking a lot of things in the show notes to all of the research that's come out since that book was written, so you can really get the full picture. So Wei Tsang, thank you very much for your time. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it.